Hello everyone, my name is Nikhil. So in this video, we will see about the API routing inside the Next.js, in which we will create a full stack application with the Next.js and what is the API routing and how does it work and how to create the backend API inside the Next.js. So let's see about the API routing inside that. So in Next.js, the API routing is used to build the APIs inside the Next.js. So we can build the APIs in the Next.js inside the API folder, and that folder will not be accessible to the front end because it runs on the Node environment in the backend terminal, but not inside the client side API, which is the JavaScript. So we can build the APIs with that, and we can also store some credentials like API keys and the password of the databases as well, because that code would not be accessible at front end at all. And then we can also create some REST APIs with that, and we don't need any separate application for creating the APIs as we do inside the React, because in the React we only have a front end application, but in the Next.js we can have the backend and the front end code in the same application only. So this is the advantage of the Next.js. So now we will see more terms about the API routing, that how does it work. So it works same as the pages routing with dynamic route structure. So it works with the same pages routing, and we can have dynamic IDs, and we can get all of these query functions and queries, parameters, and all of the things inside the API routing as well. And it is very helpful in building the REST API for any project without creating any separate application. So you just need to create the API, and then you can just call the API directly from our application, and that code will not be accessible to the front end. So that's all about the API. So now in this project we will create a bookstore project. And what is that bookstore project? So first we will build an API of the bookstore, and then we will create a dummy JSON file, and then we will work with the dummy JSON file with the file system, and after that we will have the file system with that. And after that, when the project will be completed, then we will remove the file system from there. Then we will set up the MongoDB connection, and then we will store everything inside the MongoDB database, and then we will remove the file system JSON from there. So now let's see the demo of that application. So this is the application which we want to build. So now we have some books onto the database, which is directly coming from the database, and then we can also add some book as well from here. So we can just move on to the /add, and then we can just add any book from there as well. Like if I will add a rich dad, poor dad, and then we can add a description like a new book purchased by me, and then we can add an image URL. And here I have the image URL. So if I will now just click on the submit, and the book will be then added to the database. So if we now move on to the application, and then you will see there will be a rich dad, poor dad book as well. So everything in our application is working fine. And I know that this styling is not good because this project is basically focused on the Next.js and not on the styling or CSS. So this is how we can just create some products, and all of the things are now being stored inside the MongoDB database. So everything is dynamic. So now let's start this project. So please like the video and please subscribe to the channel as well, because it will motivate me to post the videos like this. So let's start building that application. And now we are into the VS Code, and now we need to create a new Next.js application directly from the scratch. So the command to create the application would be the npx. It would be the create-next-app, and then the name of the application, like it can be the my app. So now the new Next.js app will be then installed inside the my app directory inside the API routing. So for that we just need to press enter, and the Next.js app will be then installed within very few moments. And now you can see the Next.js app is now installed inside the my app folder, and then we have the node modules folder which contains some packages. We have the pages folder which contains some routing operations, and then we have the public folder which contains the favicon.io, and then we have the styles folder for the CSS stylings. And then we have other files as well which are needed for the Next.js application. And now the application has been installed, and now we will create a simple API to get something onto the screen. So inside the pages folder, inside the API folder, in this folder we can create some files which are related to the backend and the API generation. And the code inside that folder, inside the API folder, will never be exposed to the front end. So the code inside that runs on the Node.js environment and not onto the client side API, which is the JavaScript. So if we store some credentials here like the database password, some API keys, so that would be safe at all. So now we will create an API. So now we can just move on to the API folder, and then you can see now we have the hello.js, and then you can see we have here the API function which has the export default function, which is the handler. So it is the request handler function, and then it contains a request and the response inside the parameters inside that. So now we will create an API. So if you know about building the API inside the Node or in the Express, then it would be easier for you. But don't worry even if you don't know, and I will explain everything in details, so you will get a good understanding how the API works and how to build the API. So let's start. So now you can see now we have the default API here, which is inside the hello.js. So it will be called whenever we call an API from the fetch function or the Axios from the pages slash API slash this name like the hello. So now you can say inside this function we have the handler, and then you have the request which we will receive from the front end, and then we have the response which we need to send to the front end. We will receive some request which can contain some data, which can contain so many things, and inside that you also contain that which method is being posted here, like it can be the get request, it can be the post request, it can be the delete, it can be the put, or any type of request. And after that we have the response parameter in the response which we need to send to the front end. Like here you can see inside this function we are sending a response at the response dot status, it is a 200, which is the okay. And after that we are sending a JSON message with that, with the response, and the JSON message includes a name which has the John Doe. And now you can see, now this is the API, and now this function has been exported as well. So now we can just use this function inside the pages inside the index.js as well. So now we need to call this API function here. So for that we can remove everything from there inside this div, and after that we can also remove the class name here as well. So we can remove the class name, and then we don't need any import statements here as well. So now we just have here the export default function which is the home, and now we can just start the application as well before anything. So we can just have here the hello, and then we can just start the application by moving to the slash my app, and then we can just run the command to start the development server, and it will be the npm run dev. So if you don't know about this command as well, so you can just move on to the package.json, and then you can see you have the scripts inside your application which has the dev for the development server, and then you have the build to build the application for the production, and then you have the start to start the build version on your application which has just built, which is the production version, and then you have the lint for the code quality and fixes. And now you can see we can just start the server from the npm run dev. So it will create a local development server onto the port of the 3000, and then we can visit this URL as well. So then you can see you have the control, and then you can click this URL to open it inside the browser. And now you can see the URL is now open, and now we can see the hello onto the web page. And now we need to call this API from this function as well, that is the hello.js. So now we can just call the API here. So we can just create a const, it would be the data, and it will be equals to the fetch. So the fetch function is available throughout the JavaScript and the Node.js. So we can just use the fetch, and in the fetch we have the first parameter of the URL which is required. So we can just have here the URL. So now we are already into the pages directory. So for that we can just move on to the slash API slash hello to call this hello function here. So for that we can just move on slash API slash hello. So after that the fetch function would run, and now inside this fetch now we are calling that API, and after that the fetch returns a promise. So we can just handle the then and catch statements here as well. And after the promise, now after calling this request it will receive a response, and for using this response we need to convert the response to the JSON as well to get the JSON data. And after the data has been converted to JSON, then we can just get the then again, and inside this then now we will get the data after converting to the JSON, and then we can just return the data here. So after that everything would work fine, and then we can just log here the data as well. So for that we can just have here the data. So now we can just move on to the inspect, and inside this console window, and now you can see now we have the promise here, and then we are getting the promise inside that, and after that we can get the name as the John Doe inside this promise as well. So now everything is working perfectly fine, and then we are getting the data as well after the promise is resolved. And now everything is working perfectly fine, and now you can just move on to the home function as well, and then you can just declare here a state as well to get this data inside that as well. So for that you can just have here the use state, and in the use state you will get the state variables here. So you can just get here the name and the set name, and inside the use state you will get an empty string, and then you need to import the use state as well from the React. So you just need to import the use state from the React, and after that you can just store the state variables, and then you have the data, and then you can just have here the set data or the set name. It would be the data dot, it would be the name, because we are sending the data object, and in the object we are sending the name. So if I will now just save, and inside that if we now just render the name here only, so we can just have here the name. So we can just remove the console.log as well. So if I will now just save, and now if I will now just move on to the application, we can just refresh the page, and now you can see now we are getting the John Doe inside this application, and the join is now getting from the API, which is the name inside this handle function. So now everything is working perfectly fine, and this is a get type of request because now we are sending a fetch function, and now the method of the request is now get. And if we want to send the method as the post, so we just need to have here an object with more configurations. So we can just have here the method as the post here as well. So you can see we have the method, and after that we can have some headers, and then we can have some bodies and everything inside that. So everything is working perfectly fine, and this is how we can just call the API inside the Next.js as well. So now we have seen that how to get the data from the API, and now it's time to build a project. So now we will create a project with a bookstore, and then inside that project there will be a dummy data.json file inside our directory. And after that, after the project has been completed, and then we will just work with the real data with the database with the MongoDB. So now let's start building that project. So I will now delete this hello.js file from the API because we don't need that, and inside the API now we will just create a new file, and it will be the books. So now we will have here the books.js file inside that, and now we need to call the API from this API/books and not from the hello, because now the file has been changed and it is deleted, and now we have just created the new file as the books. So now we can just create a function, so it can be the function as the handler, and inside this function first we will get the request from the front end, and then we will send the response to the front end. And after that, inside this function now we will just check if the request dot method which we get is equals to the get, and then only we need to perform a step. So we just have here one more equals to, and now we can just check the method of the request from the request.method as well, because the request object contains so many things, and it also contains the method as well. So inside this method now we will just get here the method, and inside that now we will send some book data inside that. So for that we need to create the book data as well. So now we can just move on to the API routing directory, and inside the my app directory, and inside the my app now we will create a folder as the data, and inside that we can just create a JSON data file for that. So we have the books.json, and inside that we will just have here the empty array inside that, and inside the empty array then we will have a single book onto that. So we can have a single book, and it can be a ID. So the ID can be a 1, and then we can have here the name of the book, and then the name of the book can be a mindset, and after that we can have the description of the book as well, and the description can be equals to the new book, and then we can have the image URL of the book as well with that. So we can have the image URL, and the image URL can be, we can just get the image URL from Amazon or Flipkart. So I will now get the URL, and I will now paste the URL here, and I've got the URL here, so I will now paste this URL here. So now you can see now the book is there. So now we have a single object inside the array data inside the JSON which contains a book. So for that now we can just move on to the books.js file, and inside that we have the request.method get. So if the request.method is equals to the get, now we will send the books data to the front end. So for that now we can just move on, and then we can just import something from the node.js which is available inside that, and it would be equals to the fs, which is the file system, because now we are working with the files directory inside that. So we need to import the fs, which is the file system which is available inside the node.js. So now the fs is now imported from the fs, and after that we can just move on and work with the file system. So now we need to generate the path to get to this file. So for generating the path as well, we need to import something again. We need to import the path from the path to generate the file path, and then we need to move on to this path, and then we need to read this file, and then we need to send the data to the front end. So for that now if the request.method is equals to the get, now we will just generate the path. So it can be the file path, and the file path will equals to the path dot, it would be the join. So we need to join the path. So now the first directory would be the current working directory. So the current working directory is the my app, so we need to add here the process.cwd to get the current working directory, and after that we need to enter the data. So inside the my app we have the data folder, and inside this data we have here the books.json file. So now what it is doing, so it is getting the process.cwd, which is the current working directory, and inside that directory we have the data folder, so we are getting the data, and inside that we are getting the books.json file. So now we are getting the path directly linked to the books.json file, and now we need to read the file as well. So for reading the file, so we can just have here the const the file data, and it would be equals to, the file data will be equals to the fs. We have imported the fs module, so the fs.read file So we will read the file with a synchronous way. So we will read the file sync, and after that we need to add here the path as well, as we are seeing inside the parameter. So here we need to add here the file path that we have just generated. So now we have generated the file path here. So now we are getting the file data, but the file data is in the buffer format. So for that, so now we need to convert the data inside the JSON as well. So for that we can just have the const data, and it would be equals to the file data that we have just used. So we can just pass this data into the JSON as well. So for that we have a JSON dot parse, which is available inside the JavaScript, which is available globally inside the JavaScript. And inside this JSON dot parse, now we will add here the file data that we have just received. So it will just convert the data into the JSON. So now we are getting the data. So now we need to send this data to the front end as well. So if you don't know that you are getting the data or not, so you can just log this data here. So you can just have the log, and after that you need to send the response to the front end as well. So you can just have the response dot status, and the status would be equals to the 200, which is now okay. And after that you can just have here the JSON, and after the JSON, so you can just send here the message, and the message will be equals to the data. So now we are sending a message to the front end, and now we can just return the response as well, because after we are sending the response, so we just don't need to run anything from this handler function. And after that we can just export this function as well. Export default, it would be the handler. So now what we are doing here, so we are checking if the request dot method, if there is a get request, and then only we need to perform these steps. So then we are generating the file path from the path dot join, and then we are joining the current path from the current working directory inside the data and the books.json. And after that we have the file data, and then we are reading the file from that, and then we are just converting the data to the JSON. And after that we are also logging that data, and then we are sending the response dot status is equals to the 200, which is okay. And then we are sending the JSON data inside the message which contains the data, and now everything would work perfectly fine. And now we can just create some components to render the list of the data as well. So for that, again inside the myapp directory, so you can just create a new folder as the components, and inside this components you can just create a file, and it can be the book list.js. So then inside the book list, so you can just have here the RAFCE. First you need to import the React from the React. It is optional as well. So now we are getting the book list, and inside that book list now we will call the API here. So for that we can just have the use effect function from the React to call the API, and inside that effect we will just have here the empty array of dependencies inside that. And after that we can just have here the state to store the data as well. So for that you can import the use state as well. So it will contain the data and the set data, and the by default data would be undefined because we don't need anything inside the use state by default. So now we can just import the use state as well. So now inside the use effect, now we can just declare the function before that, and it can be the send request. So it will be the send request, and it will be equals to a function. And after that we can just call the fetch function here. So it will be the fetch, and then it would be available /API/ it would be the books. So now we are sending the request to the fetch /books, and after that this is a promise. So you just need to add the then statements, and after the then you will just get the response from there, and then you need to convert the response to the JSON again, and after that you will get the data. So for that you get the data, and then you can just have the data parameter, and after the data you can just have here the set data, and inside the set data you can just have here the data dot message, that we are sending the message from the backend. So now this is the send request function, and then you can just add here the catch as well, because this is a backend operation and the database can fail as well. So you can just have the catch, and then you can just catch the parameter as the e, and after that you can just log the e as well, that what data, that what error we are getting. And after that inside the use effect, now we will just have here the data as well. So we can just call the send request function only one time because the array is empty, and after that we can just render the data here. So for that we can just have here the div, and inside that div we will have here the unordered list, and inside this unordered list we will have here the expressions, and inside that expressions we will just have here the data. So if we have the data, then we can just have here the data dot map, because it will be an array. So it would be the data dot map, and inside this map now we will get the parameters. So we will get the item, and then we will get the index as well as the second parameter, and inside that now we need to return the list item here. So we can just have the list item for now, and then we can just create a one more component here for the book item. which will just create every single list item inside that. So we can have a book item .js, and inside that book item, now we will have here the data. So we can just have here the refce again, and then we can just remove the react here as well. And after that, it will contain the li, and inside that li, it will contain the image first. So the image, the source will contain from the props, so we will receive the props here as well. So in the props, we will just have here the we can have here the name, we can have here the description, and then we can have the id of the book, and then we can also have the image url of the book as well. So we can have the image url, and after that, inside the source, then we can just have here the image url here, and after the image url, we will have the alt, and then in the alt, we can have the name of the image. And after that, we can just have here the s3 tag, which will contain the name of the book, so it will contain the name. And after the name, we can just have here the paragraph tag for the description, so we can just have here the description. And after the description, so everything would work fine. So if I will now save, so now if I will now just move on to the book list again, and now inside this book list, now we need to render the book item here after the mapping. So we will just create a book item inside that, so the book item will be then imported. And after that, we can just send some props. We can just send here the description, it would be the item dot description, and after that, we can just send here the name, so it can be the item dot name, and after the name, it can be the, we can just send here the id, so it would be the item dot id, and after that, we can just have here the image url, so it would be the item dot image url. And after that, we can just send here the key as well, because the React needs a keys to render the list. So we can just have here the key as the index that we are getting here. So now we are getting the index here, so we are sending the index, so everything would work fine. So now we are rendering the data as well inside that. So we are having the book list, and inside that we have the send request function, and then we are updating the data as well from there, and then we are checking if we have the data, and then only we need to have here the data.map, and then we will render the list inside that. And then we are using the use effect as well, and then we have the empty array of dependencies, and it would run only one time after the component is rendered. So now we need to run this component inside the index.js as well. So we can just move on to the index.js, and then we can remove everything from there because we don't need them at all. And now we can just remove the use state as well. And now inside this div, instead of this div, now we will have here the book list inside that. So we'll have the book list, and then we need to render the book list here. So if we now save, and if we now move on to the application, now you can see, now inside this handler function inside the books.js, now we got the data, and now we are getting the data inside the console.log as well. So now we can just move on to the application. Now you can see, now we are getting the data inside that, and now we are getting the data, we can get the image, and then we are getting the name of the book, and then we are getting the new book as well. And now as you can see, now we are getting the data inside browser as well. Everything is working perfectly fine, but now you can see the styling of the data is not good, so we need to style the data as well. So for that, we can just move on to the styles, and then we can just create a new css file, and it will be the books.module.css file to define some styles. And then we can just have here the first style, it would be the list container, which will be available inside the ul, and inside that we can just have here the display, and it can be the flexbox, so we will use a flexbox logic, and it would be the flex direction, it would be the row, so the by default is also row, so we don't need to specify that. And after that, we can just have the align items, it would be the flex start, and after that we can have a justify content as well, so it would again be the flex start. So after that, we can just have the list style type, so it would be the none because we don't need that round icon inside the list as well. And after that, we can just have here the flex, and the flex would be equals to the 1, so we need to get the full screen size. And after that, we can just have here the align content, and it would be the flex start again. So this style would be then applied to the ul, which is the list container. And after that, we need to apply some styles to the list item as well, so we can just generate the list item as well. It would be the list item, so the list item would have the margin, it would be around some 10 pixels. And after that, we can just have the border, and the border can be equals to the 1 pixels, it would be the solid, it would be the /ccc. And after that, we can just have here the width, so we need to specify the width for every list item, so for the width can be equals to the 200 pixels. And after that, we can just have the padding of the 8 pixels as well, So now we have just defined some styles, and now we need to import the styles inside the book list as well. So we need to import the classes from the CSS inside the modules. So after we have converted the CSS to the books.module.css, so we can just import the classes from the CSS here, like we are importing the classes. And we need to import the classes from the CSS file, like we can just move on to the directory, we can just move on to the styles, and then we can just move on to the books.module.css. So now we are getting the classes, and inside that UL now we can just give the class. It would be the class name would be equals to the classes dot, and it would be the name of this class that we are just giving here. So we are just giving the class name and the list container, so it would be the list container inside that, so it will be the list container. And now if we now save, so now you will see there will be the list container style would be applied to the list container, and now you can see the round type is also gone. And now we can just move on to the book item as well to give the style to the li as well. So we can just import, it would be the import classes from, and it would be equals to the /styles folder, and inside the styles folder now we'll have the book.module.css, and inside that CSS now we can just give the class name to the li as well. So we have the class name, and it would be equals to the classes dot the name of the class name, like inside the classes. Now we can just move on to the book modules. So we have the classes of the list item, so we can just give the class name as the list item. So now we can just save, and if we now move on to the browser, and now you can see the image style is not good, so we can just style the image as well. So inside this again, inside this books.module.css, now we can just get the list item, and then we can just target the image element from the list item, and then we can just have the width and be equals to the 100% of the parent, and the height can be equal to the 40% of the parent. So if we now save, so now you can see the styling is now perfectly good, and now you can see now we have the image, and now we can give more styles as well to the box. So we can just have the height as well. So the height can be equals to the 300 pixels, and after giving the height, so everything is working perfectly fine. So now we are getting all of the books by calling the API. So now the API for get request is working perfectly fine. Now we have seen the get requests, and now it's time to perform a post HTTP request. So with that we can create a new page, and inside that page we can create a form component, and then we can just send the data of the form, like the data which will contain a new book, and then we can send that data to the backend server, which is the API server that we have created, to store it inside a database or inside of a file that we have just created as the JSON file. So for the post request we need to modify the handler function as well. So as we are just getting here, the request.method is equals to the get. So if the get request is there, so we are performing this code, and now we can just have here the else if block as well. We can have the else if, so if the request.method would be equals to the post, and then we need to perform some steps. So the first thing which we want is we will get some data from the front end. So as we are sending the data from the front end to back end, so we will get some things from the request.body. So we will get, and we will just destructure the things from the request.body. So we will get the name of the book, so it will contain the name. Then we will get the description of the book, so we'll get the description as well. And then we will get the image URL of the book as well. So we get these three things from the request.body object from the front end. So we can just save, and after that what we need to do is we need to get the data of the file again, and then we need to insert that record there. So what we can do is we can just copy that code and we can just paste it, or that would be a code duplication. So we can just create a new function here before the handler. So it can be the function, it would be the get data, and inside that get data we can just get all of these three lines, and then we can just have this, and then we can just store these things inside the get data, and then we can return the data. So now we have the data, and now inside this get request also, so we can just have the const data equals to the get data. So we will get the get data from the function above. So now we can just save, and now inside this post request, now what we can do is first we can just get the data again. So we can just get the const data, it would be the get data. So now we need to store the newly created book into this data. So how we can do that? So first we can just create a new book. So for that we can just have a const new book, and it would be equals to, and it would be equals to an object. So the object will contain the name field, the description, the image URL, and after that, so the image URL, and after that we can just have here the ID of that book. So for the ID we can just give any ID to the books, like here we can just have here the ID would be equals to the date dot now. So it will give a number, so we can just have here the id as the date dot now. So now we are just creating a new book inside the post request. So for that, now we already got the data, so the data should be here. So after that, now we will just push the data. So we have the data dot push because it is an array of the objects, so we can just have here the data dot push, and then we will just push to the data and it will be the new book. So it would be the new book. So this is how can we do the things. So, and after sending the data to the file, then we can just return here the response as well. Return response dot status would be equals to the 2 or 1 which is created, and after then we can have a JSON message. We can have a message and it can be added, and then we can just have here the new book as well. So we can just have a newly created book. Book will be equals to the new book that we have just created. So now we are sending two messages inside the JSON. So we have the message as the edit, and then we are sending a new book which is just newly created book with that. So if we now save, if we now just move on to the application, now what we can do to perform this API call is we can just move on and we can just create a new page inside the pages folder, and it can be the add. So now we will move on to the localhost 3000/add, and then there will be a form. So for the add, there will be a function to the add book, or it can be just a add. After that, we will return a new component which we will call. So now we will create a new component as well. So inside the components folder, we will create a add book component .js, and after that there will be rafc command to create a component setup, and inside that we can just have the form. So inside that there will be a div, and after that div we will have here the form. So inside this form also we will have some labels and the input. So we'll have the label html4 equals to the name of the book, and after that we can have the input. We can just have here the input after the label, and after that we can just copy that two more times. So it would be the description, and for the image URL, so we have the label html4 equals to the name, so it will be the description, and then it would be the image URL. And now inside the inputs as well, we need to define here some properties, like we need to define the name of the input because we need to get the data, because the name is the identifier from where we can get the data. So the name is equals to the name, and inside that the name would be equals to description, and after that inside that we have the name equals to the image URL. So now we have just defined the inputs with their labels as well, and now we need to get the data of this form as well. So we can just have here the button to submit the form. It will be the type equals to the submit, and then it will be the submit, and after that now this is the form. So if we now save, and if I will now just move on to the add.js, and then we can just return this add book component here. So we have the add book, and then we can just return this function as well. So it will be the export default, and it would be the add. So if we now save, so now you will see once I will just move on to the localhost 3000/add, so then you will see there will be a form to add the data, and now you can see the form is not looking good, so we need to just style the form as well. So we can just move on to the add book. I will close other files, and now you can see we have the label. So we can have the label equals to the name for the name, and then we can have a label of the description, and then we can just have here the label for the image URL as well. So for the image URL, and then we can just generate a css style as well. For that we can just move on to the styles, and then we can just have here the form dot module dot css for defining some css styles. And what would be the styles? So first there will be the container of the form, which is the div, and inside the div we can just have here the width of the 50% of the available screen, the height of the 50%, and it will contain the margin as the auto to align it to the center, and then we can just have the margin from the top to define like it will be the 20 pixels. So now we have defined the container, and now we will define the form control, and inside this form control we have to display into the flex, and then the flex direction would be into the column. So now these two properties would be there inside the form control because we want to display it to the flex box, and then the flex direction would be into the column, so we can just see things column wise on the top of every item. And now we can just have here some more styles. We can have a justify from the content to the center of the web page, and now everything would work fine. So if we now just move on to the add book, and now we need to import the css style from there as well. So import the classes as we have done inside this book item as well. Classes from the form, it would be the /styles, slash we need to get here the form dot module dot css file. So now we are importing the classes as well from there inside the form dot module dot css. And now we can just give the styles here. So we can have a class name equals to the classes dot container, as we have defined the container, and here in the form we can have there the class name would be equals to the classes dot, and it would be equals to the form control. So now we have just defined the classes here. So if we now save, if we now move on to the application, you can refresh the page, and now you can see now we have this form, and now the form is just looking fine and not the good, because this is not a CSS course, this is a Next.js course. And now we need to get the data of the form as well. So how can we get the data? So we can just use the form handling with the use state. So we can just have here the use state snippet. So we will have the inputs object and the set inputs function to update the inputs, and then we will just import the use state. And inside that we will have the name field. The fields here inside the use state should be same as but defined inside the input names. So make sure that they both are same. So we have the name equals to the empty string by default, and then we will have the description, and the description will also be an empty string, and then we will have here the image URL, and the image URL will also be an empty string by default. After that we need to define the values for them as well. So like here we have the input equals to the name. So for the input name we can have a value would be equals to the inputs dot name, and then we need to define a onChange function. So whenever the value will be changed, whenever there will be the target change of the input, so we will just grab that new value as well. So we can just create a new function const as the handle change, and the function will be equals to an event. It will get an event by default, and then we can just call this function on every input. So then we can have on change will be equals to the function of the handle change. So then we need to save, and now we need to give value and the on change to all of the other inputs as well. So we need to give to this as well, and the value will be equals to the input dot description for this. And after that we need to give the value and the on change to the image URL as well, and then the value would be the inputs dot image URL and not the description. So we have defined the inputs, and we have defined the value equals to the input dot name for the name field, inputs dot description for the description field, and the image URL for the image URL field. So now we need to get the data of this form. So how can we get the data? So first we will just call the set inputs function to update the inputs after that. So we can have a data by just targeting the name field. We will target the name identifier for every input, and then we will just update the value from that name property as well. Like how can we do that? So we can just target the e.target.name property for the name, and then we can just update the value from the e.target.value of that specific name only. So for that, inside the set inputs, first we will grab the previous state, because we don't need to do previous state after every input is being entered. So for that we can have a previous state, and the previous state, after that we can just store the state here. So now after the previous state, now we need to first store the previous state. So we have the previous state inside that, and after that we need to just target the property. So the property would be there inside the square brackets. So we will just target the e dot target dot, it would be the name. So we'll target the name property of every text field. Like if there would be the name, so it will target this input. So if there would be the target dot name equal to description, so it will target this input. And if there would be the target equals to the image URL, it will target this input. So after we are targeting that, we can just get the value as well, e dot target dot value. So this is how the things work inside that. So now we are grabbing the first the previous state. So the previous state should also be stored inside that, and then we are targeting the property name and then the value of that property of the input. So if we now save, so now you can see, once I will just move on to the name fields, and now you can see we can just type anything inside that, and the description as well, and inside the image field as well. And now we need to get the data of what we have entered. So for that we can just have here the onSubmit function to the form, and the onSubmit function would be then called whenever we will click the submit button. So we'll have the new function as the handle submit inside that. So the handle submit would be there, and now we can just have, and then we can just declare the handle submit here as well. Once that handle submit would be equals to a function which will get an event, and after that the first thing which it can do is it can just prevent the default behavior of the HTML page, because it sends the data to the URL and it refreshes the page. So we need to stop that. So we can just have here the prevent default. So with the prevent default, it will not refresh the page and it will not send any data to the URL or anything. And after that, once we are submitting the form, so for now we can just log all of the inputs data from logging the input state from there. So if we now save, if we now move on to the application, once I will move on to the inspect, we now move on to the console, I will remove everything. So once I will click on the submit, and now you can see all of the things are now working fine. And now we are getting the values of all of the fields. We are getting the name, and then we are getting the description, we are getting the image URL as well. So everything is working perfectly fine. So now what we have completed is we have completed getting the form data. And now what after that is we can just call the API, as we have defined the API just now inside the books.js. We have defined the post request here in the else if block, and then we are getting the name, description and the image URL from the request.body. So we need to send these three things, and then it will generate a new book, and then it will generate ID of the new book as well dynamically from the date, and then it will just push the new data to the new book. So now we can just call the API here. So after the handle submit is called, so we can just have here the const, it would be the send request, and it will be equals to a function, and inside that function we will just call here the fetch function. So we'll call the fetch, and now this will be a post request. And how the post request performs inside the fetch, so we need to add /API/books to target the API/books inside that. After that we need to add here the second parameter here, and inside that book item there was only a get request, so we didn't specify any second parameter, but here we need to define. So we have the method first inside the object, because we have defined the options object. So we have the object here, and in that we have the method. The method would be equals to the post here, and after that we need to define here the body, as we are just defining the request.body inside the books.js here body, request.body. So we need to send here the body as well of the data. So the body would contain a stringified version of the data. So we can just call here the JSON dot stringify. So we will just stringify all of the data that we have. So it will contain the name. The name will be equals to the inputs dot name. After that it would be the description. So do the inputs dot description, and after that there will be the image URL, it will be the image URL, and it will be the inputs dot image URL. So now we have just defined the body, and now what after that, now we need to define one more thing inside the fetch function. It would be the headers of the request. Now we need to send the request header so that it can specify that what data we are giving from the front end. So it doesn't know that what data we are giving, so we need to specify here the headers. So the headers will contain that what type of data that we are sending. So here we have the headers object, and inside that object there will be another object which will contain the content. So it will be the content, it will be the type. So we need to send the content type would be equals to the application /JSON. So this is what we need to send inside the headers. So we need to send that the content type that we are sending is the application/JSON. So this is what we are sending, and after that the fetch returns a promise. So we can just call it the then statement as well, and the first parameter that it contains is the response. So what are the response what you are getting? So we can just convert the response to the JSON as well. So now we have the JSON converted response, and after that we get the data as well. So what data that we get? So we can just have here another then statement, and then we can just console.log that data as well. So here we will get the data after the response is converted to the JSON. So we will just console.log the data as of now. So we'll have the data inside that. So now we need to call the send request function as well. So we can just have here the validation as well inside that. So if the inputs dot name is empty, or if we don't have the inputs dot description, and if we don't have the inputs dot image URL, then we need to just return, or else we can just have here the send request function that we need to call. So now we are sending the send request. So now here we have the validation. If we don't have the inputs dot name or the inputs dot description, so if these are the empty strings, so we need to just return. Now we don't need to perform the request, and inside this else block we need to send the request to the database inside the send request. So if we now save, if we now move on to the application, if I will now just add a new book, it can be the Atomic Habits, and after that we can have a description as the new book purchased by me, and after that we can have the image URL. So I will get an image URL of that book from the Amazon or the Google. So now I've got the image URL for that. So if we now just paste the image URL, and if I will now just click on the submit, And now you can see what data did we get. So we get the log of the inputs, but we got one more data which is coming from the server side. And what is that data? So the data that we are sending from the request handler function, so we are sending a new book which has the status equals to the 200, because now the new book is now added to the database. And then you can see now we have the message as the edit, and then we have the book as well. For the description, we have generated the new ID, we have given the image URL and the atomic habits. So now the book is added to the database. So if we now just move on to the localhost /3000, and if we now refresh the page, so now if we now go to the home page, now we cannot see the newly created book. But why? If we now move on to the books handler function, so we have the handler function, and then we are just getting the data, and then we are pushing the data to the new book. But I think we have missed one thing. So we are not writing to the file. We need to write the data to the file as well. So for that we have the fs.write file, and it will be in the synchronous way. So in the write file, now we need to add the path as well. So we can just get the path again by getting the path from the file path here. So we can just get the file path here in the file path, and after the file path, now we can just add the file path inside this file path thing, because it needs a parameter of the file. We need to add the path, and after that we need to add the data inside the string. So we need to add the JSON dot stringify, because it will stringify the data, and then it will be the data. So now we are just getting the file as well, and then we are just getting the data, and then we are pushing a new book to the data, and then we are writing the file in the synchronous way, and then we are giving the file the data. If we now save, if we now move on to the localhost 3000 / it would be the add. So once I will click on the name, like it can be atomic habits, it can be the description of the, I think the description can be the, there's a new book by me, and then we can have the image URL of this. If we now move on to the inspect and the console to see if everything is working fine, we now click on the submit, and now you can see again the message is added and the response is successful. Once I will just move on to the books.json file now, and now you can see now we have the array of the books. Once I will format, and now you can see now we have atomic habits book inside this file as well. So everything is working perfectly fine, and we are just able to insert the data inside the JSON file as well. So if we now move on to the home page, and now you can see that the book is now available here as well. So everything is working perfectly fine, and now we are getting all of the books, and now we are able to just send a new book to the database as well. So for now we don't have any database, so we have just a books.json file. So everything is working perfectly fine, and now our application and the API is working perfectly fine, and the last step which is remaining is working with the real database and not with the JSON file. Although it's working fine, but having a real database in our application is always the best approach. So we will connect our application to the MongoDB database, which is a NoSQL database, and we will connect to it with a cloud version of the MongoDB. So we don't need to install anything in our system. So we will just connect to the MongoDB with a cloud link, and then we will store and get the data from there. So let's start. So for that we can just move on to the mongodb.com, and after that there will be option to the sign in. So you can just click on the sign in, and after that there will be option to log into your account. So you can just select Google or GitHub. So I will select the Google. So you can just log in from the Google, and after that you will be seeing there will be a screen, and after that you can just click on the drop down, and you can just select a new project from there. So now you can select new project, and you can give a name, and it can be a next bookstore. So you can just click on the next, and after that there will be a member. So you can just skip that, and you can just click on the create project button. So it will just create a brand new MongoDB project for our application, and now you will see our application is being created. So for that now we need to just click on the build a database button from there. Now you can see now we have a button of the build a database, so we can just click on that, and then you will see now we have three options. If you want to go with the serverless, so you can just move on to the serverless, and it's a paid version. And then if you want to move on with the dedicated version, which is an advanced version that you can use, so you can just click on that. But we will now use it with a free version, so I will now click on the free version, and I will now click on the create. So it will just create a shared cluster for us to work with the MongoDB, and after that you can just keep the default settings, and then we can just click on the create cluster. So it will just create a new cluster for our application which is working on the cloud. And now you can see now you will have a security quick start. So you can just provide the username and the password. So I will now give the username as the admin, and I will now just click on the auto generate secure password, and I will just copy that password as well inside there. So I will now keep this password here, and then we can just click on the create user. So it will just create a new user for a database to use this database, and after that you can just move on to the network access from there. So here you have the option to add the IP address. So you can just click on the add IP address button. And then if you want to allow from your current IP address, so you can just add the current IP address, but I will now allow the access from anywhere, and I will now just confirm. So now we have confirmed everything from there, and now we can just move on to the database from there. And now we have to wait till it deploys our MongoDB. And after that, to connect with the MongoDB, so we need to install a new package, which is the MongoDB. So for that, we need to stop the terminal, and then we need to install a new package, which is the MongoDB. So then it will install a MongoDB driver into our application, and then we will just connect, and then we will just play around with the MongoDB with this package. So then we have to wait till it installs. So now the MongoDB is now installed, and now we can just restart the application again from the npm run dev. And after that, now here in the books file, now we were working with the file system. So now we need to remove everything from there, from the file, and now we can also remove the get data function from there. And after we are sending this in the get request, so we were having the get data, so we need to remove that also. And now inside this name, description, and the required body, and inside this post request, now we were sending the data to the file, and now we need to remove that also. And now we were generating the ID statically from our hand, so now we need to remove that also. So now we have this API now, and now it is a blank API, and now we need to work with the MongoDB. So the first thing that we can do is we can import the MongoDB from the MongoDB. So now the MongoDB is now imported, and now what we can do is we can just have here the in the handler function. So first what we can do is we can just import the Mongo client from the MongoDB, and after that we have the function to the connect. So we have the Mongo client function which has the client connect function with the client, so we can just use that function. And after that we need to add the URL to connect to the MongoDB. So we can just get the URL from the connect button from there. So we have the connect button, and after that you have the connect to application button, and after that you have this URL here which can connect to a database. So we can just copy that URL, and then we can just paste this URL here. And after that, now we have the password. So we need to remove this statically typed password here, and then we need to add the password that we have just copied. So we can just copy that, and then we can just paste the password here. And after that, this will just connect to the MongoDB database, and it is an asynchronous task, and it also returns a promise. So we can use the await as well. So for that, we can just add here the async function for the handler, because these are the request functions and these can be async as well. So we can just have here the const line will be equals to the await. It will be the Mongo client dot connect. So it will just await for this connection, and after that it will just perform the steps. So now after the connection, now we need to create here the database. So what database that we can create? So we can have here the create database, and after the database, so we have here the const. So we need to generate a database variable const db equals to the client that we have just accessed dot db. So we have a function of the db, so we need to add here the db of the client. So we can have a db of the books. So after creating the database, now what we can do is we can just target a collection, and then we can just get all of the records of that collection. And how can we do that? So we can just create a variable inside this get request, and it would be the books. So the books will be equals to the db that we have just created dot collection. So we need to target the collection of the db, and the collection will also be the books. And after that we need to add here the method dot find. So we have a find method in the MongoDB which runs on a query. So if we specify a query here, so it will just return that records which matches the query. But if we don't add anything here, so it will just return all of the documents. And after that we can just sort that document as well, sort. And after that we can just generate the document to the array as well. So now we have the books array, and then this is also async operation, so we can just add the await for that. So now we have all of the books inside that. And after that we have the message, so we can just have here the message equals to the books. So this is how it works. And after that we can add a validation as well, like if we don't have the books, like if the database operation is failed, then we can just return the response dot status will be equals to the, it will be the 400, or it can be the 500 as the internal server error. And after that we can have a JSON message, and the message can be internal server error. And now if we have the books, then we will return the response.status equals to the 200, and then we will send the message as the books. So that should work. And now in the post request, now we can have here the await again. So it can be the db.collection, and the collection would also be the books again dot, and it would be the insert one. So we have the method of the insert one which we can use. So it will just insert a one record into the database, so we can have a new book that we have just created. So we can just store that in a variable as well. So we can just have here the const, it will be the new book, or it can be a response will be equals to this new book. So after that, now we are generating the new book, and now we can see we have the response variable. And now if you will just check the response, now you will see now we have the acknowledged and the inserted ID. So what are that? So the acknowledged is if the record is now inserted, so the acknowledged property will be true, and if the record is inserted as well, so we can get the inserted ID of that as well. So we can just save, and now we can see now we are just generating a new book as well. If we now save, and if we now move on to the application localhost 3000, and now you will see there will be nothing on to the web page as of now. Even if we move on to the inspect in the console, there will be nothing on the web page. But once I will move on to the request / add, there will be the add book, and now we can just add a new book like the atomic habits. There will be a description like this, a new book from me, and there can be the image URL like this. So once I will click on the submit, and I think there is an error. So I think the error is because now we are giving the response, so it should not be the response, or it can be the generated book. So if I will now just save, if I will now just move on to the application, once I will just click on the submit again, and now you will see now we have the message equals to the edit, and now we are just also getting the new book as well. So once I will just move on to the MongoDB again, and if I will now just move on to the browse collections to see if the book is inserted or not. So we can just move on to the collections, and then you can see now we have the database, and then we have the collection, and now you can see the books are now inserted into the database as well. So we can just delete that book from here because it was added accidentally. So now this book is now deleted, so everything is working perfectly fine. So if we now just move on to the localhost 3000, now you can see now we are getting 2 books here onto our web page, and now you can see everything is working perfectly fine. And now if we now move on, and if we now move on to /add, and if we now move on there, and now we can just add here the book as the mindset. We can have a description as again this is a new book by me. We can have the image URL as well, so I will get the image URL from the Amazon, and now I've got the image URL, so I will now paste this image URL here. So once I will just click on the submit, so now you can see the new book will be then added. So once I will just move on to the /3000, and now you will see there will be 3 books onto the database. So everything is working perfectly fine, and now we are able to get all of the books from the database, and now we are able to post the books to the database as well. So everything is working perfectly fine, and the final thing which is remaining is adding some validations to our logic. So what does that mean? So now here we can see if we have the request.method equals to the get. So we need to now format the code a little bit, and now we can just remove the create database from there. And after that, now we can see now we have the request.method equals to the get. So now this is a database operation, and it can fail as well. So we can just have here inside the try catch block. So we can just have here the try, and then we can just have here the catch here, and it will contain an error. So we will just log the error. So now we can just have here the const books inside that. So we can just remove that from here, and I will now remove that here. So we can just remove that here, and I will now paste here, and I will now create a books variable here outside of that. So let books will be equals to this, and now we can just remove this const from there. So now you can see let books, and now you can see books equals to the await this, and then if we get an error, so we will just return the error as the console.log e. And now we can see now if we don't have any books, and now we are just returning the status as the 500 as the JSON message internal server error. And after that, once we got the books, and then we are sending the message as the books. So everything is working perfectly fine. And then we can see inside the post request, now we can add some validations for the inputs as well. So we can just have here the if we don't have the name, or if the name dot trim, so it will remove this white space, will be equals to the empty string. And after that, we will check the same for the description as well. So if we don't have the description, and if the description dot trim will be equals to again an empty string, and again we will check that for the image URL as well. So for the image URL, if we don't have the image URL, and if the image URL dot trim would be equals to an empty string, and then we need to just return the response dot status to the 500, or it can be a 422 of the invalid inputs. So the 422 describes the invalid input data which comes from the front end, and after that we can just add a JSON message equals to the message, and it can be invalid data. And now we are just generating a new book after that only, and then we can just have here the const generated book before that. So we can just add here the try catch block again. We can add a try catch, And inside the try catch, now we need to run this code. So now we can just have here the generated book here. So now I will now remove this const, and I will now just create a variable as the const as the generated book. So then you will see now we have the generated book, and then we will just run this inside the try catch block because it is a database operation and it can fail as well. So after that we can just have here the return. It will be the console.log the error that we are receiving, and after that we are now sending the status equals to the 201, which is added. So if we now save, if we now move on to the localhost 3000/add, if we now add the book here, like if we now send the empty data here, click on the submit, now you can see the response will not be made, and now everything is working perfectly fine, and also the validation is also working inside the front end as well. So if we move on to the add books, and now you can see we have also added some validations here previously as well. But if I will now just remove everything from there, if I will now just have this send request function, so if I will now save, refresh the page, and then if I will now just click on the submit, and now you can see now we got the message as the invalid data, because now we can see the error is the 422, which is unprocessable entity, and the invalid data is being posted here. So we have the validations on the both and the front end and the back end as well. So everything in our application is perfectly fine, and now we have just completed the application. We have just created some books onto the first the JSON file, and then we were having the file system, and then we connected to the real database, and then we inserted and we got all of the books which we then stored inside the database. So everything in our application is completely fine and everything is working, and this is the final summary of our application. So we have the books onto the front end, and then we can just add the books to the database as well. So everything is working perfectly fine inside the API routing. So this is the application that we have built. So we have built the API routes inside our application. We have created the REST API for getting and for sending the data to the database, and then we are storing the data inside the MongoDB as well. And then we have created a full stack application with the Next.js, and this was a very basic application, but I hope you have learned a lot from this module. So thank you for watching this video, and I hope you will like the video as well. So please like the video and please subscribe to the channel as well, so I should be motivated to post the videos like this. So that's all for this video. So thank you.